Welcome to the Charon Files. The stories you are about to hear are testimonies from living witnesses of what moves beyond understanding, of what refuses to be explained. Each of them stood at the edge of what is known and looked into what lies beyond it. My name is Charon, Ferryman of the Dead, the one who waits at that edge. What follows is what they brought back. May they prepare you for your own future encounters. There are encounters that defy the very language by which humans attempt to define their reality. These are moments when the known world dissolves, replaced by a presence that cannot be seen, cannot be named, yet is undeniably felt. It is a peculiar form of impact, often leaving no visible mark, yet altering the witness in ways both subtle and profound. The memory of such an event lingers, a persistent shadow, a question without an answer. It is the chilling recognition that something exists beyond the familiar, something that touches and changes the essence of an individual, even as it remains unseen, leaving only the knowledge that it was there, and it was real. Ethan, in Land Between the Lakes, Western Kentucky, recounts an experience camping in the woods, where he witnessed something he could not identify, and the memory of which remains with him still.
I don't know to this day what it was exactly. I saw that night camping in Land Between the Lakes in Western Kentucky. This happened a bit over 2 decades ago. My dad hunted, mainly bow hunting, there regularly, and while I never was a hunter, I loved camping in the woods. We never used any formal campsite back then. We'd drive along the trace, turn off onto one of the numerous side roads, and then, near a creek bed, usually dry or just a small trickle from a spring, unless it had rained, we had our usual campsite. We pulled the car off the road, set up the tent, tarp it all over angled, and Dad would do his thing while I would do mine. Typically, if I went with him, that meant, and this time as well, he'd trek off to his stand and would be gone most of the day. While he was off, I'd hike a bit. Land Between the Lakes, while big, is not a place one could easily get lost in if you have basic survival skills, read, or just relax. For me, it was a place to go to get away from it all, get lost in nature or in a good sci-fi book. This early morning, he had left after a quick breakfast, a chill and dampness in the air, the smell of fall coming in. Any of the outdoor types will understand that smell of wet leaves during fall. Dad had left, and I whittled some on the hickory staff I had made before heading out for a very early morning hike. I set off in the usual direction, opposite from the road we were nearby, mostly following near the creek, but not along it directly. I had a compass if I needed, but I never did. I had grown up in the Jackson Purchase, and it was home. I loved nature and never felt uncomfortable out in the woods. Before long, however, cresting a small hill, I heard rustling among the trees. While the leaves were starting to fall, most were still up, fall at its prettiest. I slowed only for a moment. I'm used to those sounds, squirrels typically, bounding from tree to tree. But then it got louder, heavy, unlike any sound I've heard trees make outside of them breaking under ice or age. It was hard to focus on the sound, like it was coming from all around me, but not, and every direction I turned, I saw trees in the distance, shaking, as if something large just jumped from them but saw nothing else. Then, I was in my early 20s, and despite years of being in the woods for many of them, I felt something I never really had before. Fear. Not terror, that would come later, but actual fear. Almost as soon as it hard started, the rattling, violent shaking of trees focused, not in a ring around me, to one before me, opposite of the direction of camp, and then, nothing. No sound at all. Not quiet, but an absence almost. Somehow that relaxed me. I had been exposed to that stillness before, and while the violent rustling of multiple trees felt alien, this was familiar. I thought about going back, until I saw in the distance, near the last tree that shook, a slim, dark figure. I couldn't make her out. Somehow I felt it was a her, but she was up near the ridge ahead, and I felt compelled to head to her, and I did. But as I walked towards her, she slid away, staying just barely visible among the trees. The sky was just starting to really lighten up, that transition from dawn to morning. and slid was the right word, I feel. She moved what appeared to be normally, but the distance she seemed to cover was unnatural. I'm tall at over 6 feet tall, but my strides covered half the distance hers did, and she seemed normal-sized. As normal-sized as a dark, featureless shape could be. I could see a head, arms, legs, what appeared to be dark but normal clothing, but I couldn't track her. Focusing on her was hard, and outside of knowing it was a her, I could tell nothing else as she disappeared and reappeared among the trees a couple 100 yards ahead of me, walking slowly yet somehow covering distances at running speeds. Again, I don't know why I followed her, but I did, down a hill through some fog until I neared a clearing. I lost sight of her as I neared it, and things got darker, like when the sun crawls behind a dense cloud, except there were none that I could see, though the sun was still too low for me to catch. The stillness, familiar, was there, but that didn't bother me. It was the smell that did. Every step closer to the clearing, I noticed it more and more, and though I couldn't find her, and I desperately wanted to find her, sent alarm bells through me. I've been both before and since, in the woods hundreds of times. One thing I have never experienced since that weekend was the complete absence of smell. Nature has a smell, not a stink, but one that is distinct. One of decay and life, of plants and trees and creeks and stagnant ponds. And while, depending on where you are at, you may or may not smell the same smells, there always is in. Except, there was nothing. That lack slowed me, stopped me, and only then did I see her, across the clearing, looking at me. I wish I could say she was giant and hairy, or alien gray. She looked normal, indistinct and unmemorable, except for her smile. When she smiled, I ran. I had been scared before, with the trees, out in the middle of land between the lakes, but the lack of any smell, sound, and that smile, it terrified me, and I ran. I was crying and terrified, and I had no idea why I should be. I stopped about halfway back, and everything was brighter, and despite my terror, I still wanted to turn back. I did look back, and though she was just a shape again, she was there, closer, freezing as I spotted her. A smile again, but one I felt and did not see, and I ran, all the way back to the tent. I did not and could not understand. I stayed in the tent until my dad got back, and I didn't tell him about it. By then the terror had faded, and while I couldn't explain it, I knew something horrible would have happened had I gone into the dark clearing that had no smells or sound. By night, I had almost convinced myself I had half imagined it all, when, stepping away from the tent to pee, that stillness came over and I froze. I looked among the trees but saw nothing until I saw 2 reddish lights, moving in the distance. I knew the terrain and knew it had to be uphill from me, but the eyes were descending. I felt her in the sense I had felt it was a woman earlier, coming my way, and I felt a smile that was not a smile even though I could not see it. I ran back to the tent and my dad was there, staring into the fire, and when I yelled at him, he just sat there, not responding. I shook him, feeling those eyes, that her, behind, and then even the fire had no smell to it. It was just nothing. I shook my dad harder, screaming at him, and then suddenly, the fire was crackling. I could smell the smoke, and the stillness was gone. My dad asked me what the hell I was yelling about, and when I told him, he gave me that look I mentioned, that sideways glance that said, "Are you okay?" After much pressuring, we left, and while I barely held it together, as soon as I got in my room at our house, I cried. I knew for a fact, had I not reached my dad, had not shook him, that I would have wandered off in the dark, just like I would have wandered off in the morning, following her. She wanted me in that clearing, which felt wrong, smelled of nothing, and I wonder, and have wondered so many nights what would have happened. I probably, and hopefully will never have an answer. I just pray I never see or feel her again. I've been in the woods since then, both near there and other woods, and never have I felt that way again. But still, every time the woods get quiet, I get scared.
Daniel, in Lilydale, New York, describes an encounter in the woods with an entity that left him with an unseen injury and a persistent drain upon his being.
I was out for a walk alone in the woods when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for lack of a better term, absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc it leapt at me. There was no breeze of motion. There was no air at all. As it struck, I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen, somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands and arms and legs and torso seemed fine, and I wasn't bleeding, but I knew I'd been injured somehow. As I fearfully ran back home, I could tell that I was less. I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus at times. The solution at that early stage was easy. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. For a while, that subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. My life began that week, actually, because that was when I met Mar. She and I got along great, though. To be honest, I'm pretty sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched on to some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The color of a neighbor's car changed from dark blue to black one morning, and I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later, at work, a coworker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said his name had always been Dan. I figured I'd just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as this sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down, and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. Mar showed up that evening, but she had her own key. "Hey," I asked her with confusion. "How'd you get a key?" She just laughed. "You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She opened a door and entered a room full of boxes. I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating 3 months. Living together? I'd literally just met her the week before. Thing was, my mother had always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my yap. Instead of causing a scene, I told her everything was fine, and then I went straight to my room and began investigating. My things were just as I had left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation, but I did find something out of the ordinary: the date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or in-jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. That fury helped suppress the entity. I never imbibed alcohol. I drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every time I woke up. For 3 years, I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. A social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing. The layout of nearby streets, the time my favorite television show aired, that kind of thing. Always, those changes reminded me the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I ever let myself zone out. One day, I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story. Right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, "Who are you? How did you get in here?" He laughed and smiled brightly. "Silly daddy." My heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old, and that he was my son. The agony and heartache filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I would never see or know the first years of his life. Mar and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I'd lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. The priests didn't believe me and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. The doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on all their scans and tests, but they happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time I ran out of options, I decided to tell Mar. There was no way to know what this all looked like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly, I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser. But I still had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home inside my own head. The night I set up a nice dinner in preparation, she arrived not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered, and found that she was in a nice dress. She was happily surprised by the settings on the table. A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me. Thank the Lord I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone on about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so it went for a few years, from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple months. When I found myself in a new place and time in my life, I just shut up and listened, making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the farthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said, writer. I told him that was a fine idea. Then, I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Mar, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go-around, and I came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there, eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said she marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted she was the one. That was the first time I'd truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason she'd considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed like I'd wanted to believe. The closest I can describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having only weeks. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times in my life, heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused, forever lost. Only an instant in each time meant I would never be able to speak with anyone else, never be able to hold a conversation, never express or receive love. As the true depth of that fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in a place. The pure emotional peace it brought was like a panacea on my mental wounds. And I'd never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of the times I'd gone sledding or built a snow fort as a child. A teenager touched my arm. "Grandpa? Eh?" He'd startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. "Who are you?" He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you read it and tell me what you think?" Ah, of course. Pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see. He burned bright red. Trying to, anyway. All right, run off, I'll read this right now. The words were blurry, and annoyed. I looked for glasses I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read his book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. Mar puttered in and out of the living room, still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time I would have there. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway, and I saw my son, now adult, walk by with his wife on the way out the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story, and I called out for my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. How was it? Well, it's terrible, I told him truthfully. But it's terrible for all the right reasons.
Owen, in Savannah, Georgia, recounts a night in a rural Airbnb when a series of whistles from the dark woods outside instilled in him a paralyzing, profound fear.
Last winter I stayed in a super rural Airbnb for about a week. This happened the night before my last night there. Really nothing odd happened the whole week. The woods were completely dark and you couldn't see any lights from other houses, which was great for me. The whole place had huge windows all around looking into the woods, and that night I was walking around one of the rooms when I heard a quick, sharp whistle from outside. I genuinely don't get scared easily by stuff outside in the night anymore, but it was so weird. The instant I heard it, I was so full of fear that both my eyes and nose started watering. I stood there kind of paralyzed for a second before I heard another whistle and just instantly went to close all the curtains and blinds and turned off the lights. I don't know why I felt the need to do that, but I sat there in the dark on the floor so full of fear that my nose was literally dripping and tears were pooling in my eyes. I had the windows fully open so I could hear the whistle intermittently getting closer until it sounded like it was literally right outside, and I was shitting fucking bricks for some reason, which was just freaking me out more. I was straining to hear whether I could hear footsteps and whether it might just be a person. I kept hearing weird noises, but nothing that sounded at all like a person walking, nothing that sounded like anything discernible. I waited for what felt like forever, until I hadn't heard the whistle for a long time and ended up crawling into bed and not looking out any of the windows. This event just stays in my mind because of how seemingly irrationally scared I was. I walk around in the woods at night regularly and have even ran into hunters and weird people, and I was not once so scared that I felt like that. I silently sat on the floor with my nose and eyes dripping and kept thinking, why am I doing this? And I just could not make myself move and look out the window or do anything. And I lived in this area for 25 years before that. I'm very familiar with the wildlife noises, and I don't believe the sound was any bird or animal. Sometimes when I think of it, I can still feel the fear so much that my eyes water again, and I just wonder what the fuck that was.
The weight of the unseen, the chilling certainty of a presence that defies form or explanation. These are the burdens these witnesses now carry. The names of the witnesses have been changed to maintain anonymity. If what you have heard tonight mirrors something you have experienced, leave your story in a comment below and we will include it in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss